I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 38 of EO Radio Show. This week, we launch a series of quick tip episodes, starting with the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. With the help of our crackerjack paralegal, Joe Hilliard, we'll tackle the basic filing mechanics for nonprofit corporations, starting with Delaware and California today, and we will work our way through the other states in future episodes. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the state filings for corporations today, let's set the stage a little bit. Nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entity. Other varieties include partnerships and limited liability companies, for example. The laws of all the states prescribe the certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be regulated and subject to legal process as a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like natural people. This is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the laws, they have to provide notice as to their legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information. So in this episode, while we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate or even whether to incorporate at all, sometimes a different form is better, such as LLC or trust. But instead, what we're going to focus on today are two states, Delaware and California, and we'll talk about the differences between those states with regard to things like ease of formation, standardized documents that are available, filing fees, turnaround time, and similar matters. My guest today is Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella. He specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular, charities that are tax exempt as Internal Revenue Code 501c3 entities. Prior to working at Farella, Joe worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. He also worked for the law firm Morrison & Forster in their intellectual property litigation group. Hi, Joe. Thanks for being willing to put together this series of quick tips on state registrations that apply to nonprofits.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Let's start with Delaware. Delaware is a very commonly used state of formation for nonprofits. Tell our listeners a little bit about why nonprofit corporations often go to Delaware.
Of course, Delaware really offers a lot of benefits to a nonprofit. They have low filing fees. They have low state taxes. And the ability to use an agent as the address and no need to have a physical business presence. The biggest reason, though, is to take advantage of the legal and liability protection of established corporate laws. Simply put, Delaware, and through their Secretary of State, they have streamlined and make formations easy and minimize any and all outside concerns.
So walk us through the documents that are needed to form in Delaware. Where does a founder start with their Delaware process?
Delaware does not have a form per se for creating a nonprofit corporation. There are exemplars on their system that has wording that you can use, but really the filed document is just a 2 to 3 page certificate of incorporation with the articles that enumerate the name that you've chosen, the address of the registered agent you have decided to use in Delaware, certain 501c3 purpose language, and an adherence to state and IRS codes.
So how expensive is Delaware? I know the filing fees vary across the various states. Where does Delaware sit in that spectrum?
Delaware is pretty reasonable. The filing fee is $115 plus any service fees associated with the agent you have chosen. We haven't discussed this, but the agent will supply an address for you to use in Delaware and will provide in-state services on an annual basis. This includes any mail that comes to you will be forwarded, and if there's an action with the court, it will be served on you at that address, and they will again forward that to you.
Our startup time also in the various states is quite variable. How responsive is Delaware when you file that certificate of incorporation? How long does it take to get that back?
So while the Delaware website at current notes that their normal processing time is 3 to 5 business days, at current, as of April 2023, the time is really closer to 4 to 6 weeks. So what you can do, you can always expedite depending on that timing need. For corporations in Delaware, the fees range from high to low. For next day service, you only pay $50 more. For same day, as long as you file before 2 Eastern time, is $100. If you need it in 2 hours, the expedite is $500. And if you need it within an hour, it's $1,000. Generally, in terms of timing, because it's only $50, we do recommend using that next day expedite for any and all filings. It just makes it simpler and it gives you your papers right away so you don't have to think about it or worry about it coming in the mail.
So $1,000 for 1 hour turnaround. Have you ever used that? That's a lot of money to pay to get something back that fast. But I can't imagine when you would need it that fast.
We have had occasions more on the business side, the nonprofit side, where something needs to be filed. They realize that they need a new entity at the end of the year. So it comes down to December 28th, December 29th, going into that, if like the 31st is a weekend, and suddenly they need something. I've used the 2 hour for $500. I think I did that last year for one of our clients, but I don't think I've used the 1 hour. But yes, at the end of the year, it becomes something that when push comes to shove and people think about what they really need to do and when they have to have something for various tax purposes, yes, we have used those expedites.
And that's a really good point. I don't know that there's another state that will actually turn it around in an hour. So maybe that's a very compelling reason to go to Delaware if you're super time sensitive. So let's talk a little bit about the annual filings that I think every jurisdiction has either annual or biannual filings that the corporation has to file in order to keep themselves active with the Secretary of State's office.
Yes, that is correct. Delaware is tied to the same day every year. It's not tied to when you formed it. So once a corporation is formed, corporations have an annual report due March 1st every year for the year prior. As we said, that's irrespective of when the corporation was formed. So on March 1st, 2023, I filed the 2022 annual reports for entities that were formed. In January of 2022, October of 2022, and even as we just spoke about, December of 2022. All of those entities are due on the same day, and that would be March 1st of the year after. It makes it strange because usually you would think that you're paying it ahead, but this is actually a post payment.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I didn't realize that. So how expensive is this annually? We've got our startup filing fee of $115, whatever we paid the agent, and then every year we have to pay an additional amount.
So as a nonprofit, the fee is only $25 a year. A normal corporation or an LLC, as we'd mentioned before, have different numbers attached to them, but they do make again, this is one of the benefits of Delaware. As a nonprofit, the cost is low. It's only $25.
So we've only been talking about the Secretary of State so far. Then in some states, there's other state agencies that have to be notified that you've created an entity. And there's also an outside agent for service of process that you sometimes have to have. Can you talk a little bit about both of those other state agencies and what the typical agent for service of process is in Delaware? How do I find somebody to be my agent there?
Yes. In terms of other state agencies, this goes back again to why you use Delaware and the ease of their laws. They don't have any other entity. You just go through the Secretary of State there in Delaware, and that covers everything that you need to be in that state. That goes back to, again, where you just talked about the agent. The agent is the only address that needs to be used there. And in terms of finding an agent, we recommend certain national entities just because there's always issues, as we've already been talking about, going into other states. We use somebody like CSC, which is Corporate Services, or we use RASI, Registered Agents. You can find them online. Just look under Corporate Agent Services. There's other smaller ones like Paracorp, places like that are out there. And again, that's what their business, that's all they do is represent you in states. And if there are issues, they will even go to the state with you or for you to help facilitate filings if there are any issues or if there are any questions.
So that's an important distinction in Delaware is you almost basically have to use an agent, right? And that's an extra level of fees, where in some jurisdictions you wouldn't have to have a paid agent to run that, to do that service, right?
Yes. So no matter who your agent is, they have to have a physical address in the state. As we've talked about, those of us in California, I mean, Delaware's smaller than either San Francisco, where you are, or the greater Los Angeles area where I am. It's relatively small. You couldn't put all of these businesses physically into physical addresses there. That's what you have the agent for. We just talked about CSC, for instance. Off the top of my head, I probably have 300 entities that use them as their agent there at current. And that's just me as a relatively medium to small sized client for them. There are literally thousands of entities formed there every day. So they use that address for that, and it gives you that ease. But as we talk about other states, we can talk about, again, if your business physically is in the state, there's no reason not to use yourself as the agent or someone else that you have in the state.
Okay, great. So that's an important distinction. There's some additional cost to that, but there's, as we've talked about, there's other benefits to being in Delaware. The state costs are relatively minimal.
The state and the agent would both be really low risk, low cost, especially as we talk about other states. Yes.
State number 2. Well, let's talk about our home state where you and I both are, California. Why would you form in California instead of Delaware? I know there are some good reasons to be here, but talk a little bit about the nonprofit that's in California.
The real primary reason a nonprofit would be here in California is, again, falling under California law. If you do business here, even as a nonprofit in California, you have to have a legal presence. You have to have an entity registered here in California. And that goes back to, real briefly, as we've already talked about, Delaware. Even if you formed in Delaware, that does not give you these California protections. So you would have to register that entity in California. The registration will follow, with only minor differences, exactly how you would register or form a new company. You have an incorporation versus a registration, and it's counterintuitive perhaps if you're not in the legal field, but they call you a foreign corporation if you're not in the States. So when I refer to a foreign corporation, that would be our Delaware entity as we go forward.
Yeah, and just as a side note for our listeners, there are a whole host of different legal implications from being in California and not being in California. If you're incorporated in Delaware and you want to leave California's jurisdiction, that's easier than if you're incorporated in California. And there's some California corporate laws that might not be what you want for your charity. So we're not going to go into those legal distinctions today. We're just really focusing on the mechanics. So coming back to mechanics in California, Joe, what does our founder need to file in California?
Unlike Delaware, the state of California does offer you a one-page fill-in form that has stuff for your address, for your agent, etc. However, that form is relatively limited. And even there, it calls out for you to put an attachment to be added to the document as you put it together, like an attachment A. And that covers a lot of the 501c3 specific language that you would have there. We recommend, really, much as we discussed with Delaware, drafting a full document and file that. And just like we talked about with the Delaware, this would be a 2 to 3 page article. Here, there are articles of incorporation versus a certificate of incorporation in Delaware. And those articles would, same thing, enumerate the name, the address of the registered agent, the 501c3 purpose language, and adherence, again, to specific California and IRS codes. The issue to consider here, we'll talk about more about timing, but we'll talk about a little bit about timing here already, is that the form with an attachment can be filed online through the Secretary of State's website portal. But a fully drafted doc, which you have crafted on your own or you and your counsel have crafted, must be filed in person or via U.S. mail with the Secretary of State. It's a product of what their relatively new website portal. They only put it into place literally a year ago. It was April of 2022 when they put this in place. And while the Secretary of State has said they will update it to allow for non-form filings online versus just using the forms, they haven't really said anything other than that when they first did. I think there was some excitement on the Secretary of State that they would be able to make things more streamlined all the way around, but they still haven't got to that. And they haven't really set an ETA for that. So again, it's a trade-off. The document that you get by drafting your full document is much more user-friendly to not just your attorney, but to you as a nonprofit. When you give it to other people, it's much easier to read than the form that has sort of attachments that backload it. So we recommend still taking the time to do that and then having it filed in person.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the cost and then get back into timing and things like practicalities. In California, what does it cost to incorporate a nonprofit? I think in Delaware, you said it's $115.
Yes. In California, part of the COVID era impetus by California to encourage business growth here, they actually have waived the filing fees from last year, from the beginning of 2022 up until June 30th of 2023, all formations of all entities in California are $0. There's no cost whatsoever. That being said, into April, they haven't said that they're going to extend it past July 1st, 2023 yet. However, even if they do, the normal fee, again, is only $30 for a nonprofit, much like we talked about Delaware. California also encourages nonprofits to have a lesser fee attached to them.
So let's talk about timing. I guess this kind of goes back to whether you've made the choice to file the online web-based form with an attachment or the customized, more user-friendly kind of traditional articles of incorporation. What's the timing?
I looked at their website. They do actually have the California website updates daily exactly how long it's taking and different types of stuff. So they actually break it down by corporations versus LLCs versus limited partnerships. And then they break it down further in there, whether it's an amendment or whether it's an actual formation. And then they break it down a third by whether you've done it by mail, whether you've done it in person, or whether you've done it on the online. When I looked yesterday, and so this is current for most of April, I've seen the same. Both in-person and online filings are both running 5 to 7 business days for the last month or so. So there isn't really right now a timing difference. Sometimes there is. This time last year when they started up the new system, they had put a slowdown on certain things, and in-person filings were taking 4 to 5 weeks, and the online were still taking within that 5 to 7 business days. So it always pays to check their website to see what their timings are as you're thinking about that. Much like we were talking about with Delaware too, they do have expedite available here in California. It's a bit more expensive, and there's only a couple of options. They have $350 for a 24-hour expedite, and their 24 hours is a literal 24 hours. So if I file it at 2 p.m., I will have it by 2 p.m. the next day. But if I filed it at 11 in the morning, I will get it by 11 in the morning. They don't do it as a 24 hours equals 1 business day. They do 24 hours as 24 hours. Using their website, having done this on there, it really is. I've had stuff that comes through at 9, 10 o'clock at night that I've put in at like 8, 9 in the morning. So I'm expecting to get it at 8, 9 in the morning. It'll come in that way. They also offer for $750 a same day, but their caveat there is that you have to have it in by 9:30 a.m. to obtain by a 4 p.m. that day. So those are both available. They're only available for online filings. You cannot expedite your in-person. This was a change when they switched over to updating their website portal last year. Before you could expedite in person too, but you no longer can. So this is only available for filings. This goes back to discussing whether you need to have it immediately and what kind of form you want it to look like. In my experience, too, both of these experiences, I actually filed one on a 24-hour expedite yesterday, and it came back in an hour and a half. So quite frankly, I don't, from history, seeing that if there really is an expedite, the 24 hours seems to work best. It doesn't seem like there's any need for the same day because they've come back relatively quickly as it is. So,
well, that's good to know. Let's talk a little bit about the annual filings and what has to be included on that annual filing. I think this is a little bit different than Delaware, where you said Delaware, everything is due on March 1st, and that's the annual information that you update with this Secretary of State. How does California work? It's not everything's due on March 1st in this state, right?
No, that is correct. In California, the filings are all tied to the day that you formed your company. So your first bite at the apple, as they say, is not a year out or tied to that. Here in California, you have to file a statement of information every time you do this. And so the initial state information is due within 90 days of the formation. So today is April 19th, May, June, July. In theory, July 18th or July 19th would be the last day to file that initial statement of information. At this juncture, we haven't talked a little bit about privacy in Delaware. California has a much lower threshold, I don't know if I want to say lower or higher. Let me think about this.
It requires more information, basically.
Yes,
California wants to know more. They want to know more.
California has a lower threshold for privacy. They actually require more information to be presented to the public. As we talked about with Delaware, basically the agent is the name on it. Even when you do that annual filing that we talked about, basically you put an address in the state where you are, and you name an officer and your directors, but it's not public information. But in California, starting with this first initial statement of information due 90 days, you have to name all of your top level officers for your corporation. You name the president, you name the treasurer, and you name the secretary. As a nonprofit, you do not have to name your directors. That's only if you are a for-profit corporation. So your directors will still be given their privacy, but whoever you have as your top 3 officers will all need to be identified going 90 days in. And then after that 90 days, for your California, a biannual statement will be due at the end of the month the entity was formed. So what that means, since we're in April, if I formed the company April 1st, 2023, or today, April 19th, 2023, their initial statement will be due by July 19th, 2023. And then their next statement of information will be due by April 30th, 2025. And then the next one thereafter, 2027.
So who reminds you of that date? Does the Secretary of State send some kind of communication to keep that top of mind, or is it my responsibility to keep track of those dates?
For the most part, that is up to you to remember and to follow up with. On the website, they do have the option, as we just talked about, where you file them online, and then the statements of information, which can be filed online. You follow up with them, and there's a click where you can say opt into email notifications. The system is relatively new. Like we said, it's only been a year, so I actually haven't seen any come up yet, since most of my stuff is biannual anyways. But my understanding is, yes, if you check that, once you file that initial statement of information, you will get an email prompt roughly 60 days prior to your next annual being due, saying, hey, you've got this amount of time to do that. That being said, it's definitely best practices to calendar that yourself, whether it's just on your Outlook. I know that we do that here. We have a calendaring service through our firm, and most firms do. Or if you use your CPA for these type of things, I'm sure your CPA could calendar that in terms of when your taxes are due as well. But yes, the best practice is definitely not to rely on the state of California to remind you of anything.
And how much does this annual statement of information cost? It's not annual, it's biannual, right?
Yeah. So we'll do that really quick. We'll discuss that annual versus biannual. If you form your company in California, then yes, it is biannual. We talked about registering Delaware entities. If you register a Delaware entity in California, their statement of information is due annually. So you will have one. And that still ties back to the date that you registered it. So if I formed a company in January in Delaware, but I don't register it until April here in California, it's the same thing. It follows April every year. Those statement of informations for corporations, that's only $25.
So not a huge amount of money. It's more the annual headache of making sure you get your statement of information filed every year for your foreign organization and every other year if you're a California corporation. Quick question, that statement of information for my Delaware entity, does that statement of information include the officers of the Delaware Incorporated nonprofit? Or is that statement of information just tied to the agent for service of process in Delaware?
You don't have to name all of your officers in Delaware. You have to name one, and that's the one who will be the named signatory to it. But there you do need to name all of your directors. But again, it's private. It's something that's only filed with the state. It's not a document that can be pulled. It'll only show that you filed it and that you're in good standing, but an outside party can't pull that. Versus, as we're talking about the California statements, I can go to the California website right now, the Secretary of State website. I can pull all the current statements of information, for the most part, going back since they've upgraded their system, probably the last 9 to 10 years minimum for any entity that's older. I can pull all of their statements of information, so I can actually see changes in officers, changes in addresses going back. All of that is public and available online through the California Secretary of State. It's much more, again, there's not a big level of secrecy versus, let's say that there's not a level of privacy that's available in California versus where we talked about Delaware, where all I can do is really see that the entity was formed and I can see their agent. That's all I can see when I look them up online. And I have to go through a service to actually have copies pulled, or I have to set up an account with the state to physically pull documents and do a lot of filling out of forms to make sure. So there's a different level of privacy between Delaware and California. And again, this goes back to why Delaware is an interesting position and an interesting place to use.
And just a note for listeners, there's a whole host of other public databases with information about charitable corporations. So while the actual corporate documents, like Joe said, it's a lot less transparent in Delaware, more transparent in California. But some of this information is available anyway through the couple of other state agencies in California, which include the Registry of Charitable Trusts in California for a California incorporated nonprofit and a Delaware incorporated nonprofit that is required to register in California that's doing business here. There are two other agencies that step into the fray, and those are the California Franchise Tax Board and the Attorney General's Registry of Charitable Trusts. And the latter, the Registry of Charitable Trust, does post a lot of information about the charity and its officers and directors and financial position. That's all published online. So some of that transparency is going to apply to the Delaware nonprofit that comes here anyway. I think that covered all the points we really wanted to get to in our Delaware and California episode. Anything else top of mind, Joe, that you want to mention before we wrap up?
I think we covered quite a bit there.
We did. And I think you gave me a list of a lot more resources to put in the show notes that cover a variety of different things. What sort of things can we post there to help the listeners to find out more information?
What we've got there, we've got the top level Delaware and California Secretary of State websites, so you can see what they look like, what their front facing looks like. And then for both of them, I've got separate links for how you can do entity searches in both of those, so you can see who's registered, how, and then once you find one that you're interested in, you can open it up and look and see what all this information we're talking about, how that shows up. I've linked to their separate forms, so you can see what their forms look like, and especially in California, where you have a very robust set of forms versus Delaware, which gives you more of an exemplar type system. I've linked to both the fee structures that you can look at, so you can see where these expedite fees come from and what they say about them. And you can also see the basics. Again, we've talked about how statements of information cost, how much the different filings do, and if you do need to amend later, how much those amendments cost.
The very first thing we always do, which I should have thought of earlier, and that is, can I use the name I want? I know we should have started at the very beginning, but sometimes these things occur to me at the end. In the two states, how do you go about checking your name before you even go down this path? Again,
we just talked about both of them have name search portions on their website. So you search and see if that's the easiest way to see if the name's available.
And that's in the show notes. You've got a link.
In the show notes, it has the links to both of those. Yes.
Okay.
The real quick thing too, as we talk about this, is that they are entity type specific, the names. I want to call mine ABC Foundation, and I see ABC Inc., and I see ABC LLC, but I don't see ABC Foundation. In both states, you still will be able to register that name because they're fundamentally different in the background in terms of what type of entities they are. So that's always good to keep in mind. Just because you see the name, look at it further, think about it. But if there's something that's really simple, like that's close, like I just said, I want to do ABC Foundation, and I see there's no ABC Foundation, but there's an ABC1 Foundation, both states will more than likely ding you and say, no, you cannot have that name. It's too similar to someone that's in place. So that's something to keep in mind when you do that. And as we were just talking about, especially in Delaware, there's thousands of entities formed every day. So a lot of the basic, simple stuff that you would think of is obviously taken. So we try not to think too far out of the box in terms of what you want to do, but think about something that's not necessarily generic, I guess, for want of a better term. And with that, if you've already got a name in place and you're not quite ready to form, though, you can do a name reservation in both states, and those will hold the name for you for 60 days. So you have a time frame to then file once you've kept the name. And the same thing that will prevent other people from using that name. An odd quirk in California, especially if you, as an out-of-state registration, we just talked about this, to get around that, if the name is available in Delaware and you formed it, but then you want to register in California, you find the name in California already here. The simple workaround is they let you use an AKA in California. You just put a parens and DE for Delaware at the end of your name, and you can register that. And then in the background, it'll still have your true Delaware name registered and listed with it. So that's one of those little quirks that you have in the system. But yes, it is always good to, especially as we've talked about, if you're expediting, if you suddenly need something on a rush, to have perhaps an entity or 2 or 3 different names in mind to go through and say, hey, let's check all of these names.
All right. Good to know. So there's probably lots of other topics we could go into, but I think I've taken up enough of your time today, Joe. I really appreciate you being willing to come on and fill in our listeners on some of these nuts and bolts. That's all we have for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for the links to the resources Joe and I were just talking about. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Varela, Braun & Martell. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.